Once again, we're seeing real strife in the Middle East between the Palestinian terrorists and Israel. It started with protests at the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem recently, where hardliners from the Jewish and Muslim sides shared some of the blame, and Israeli police intervened with some considerable force. But in the end, this mattered little because the tension was simply used as a pretext by Hamas terrorists in Gaza who took their cue to do this. Yeah, once again, the extremists were launching deadly missiles indiscriminately into Israeli civilian townships and the suburbs even of Tel Aviv. At least 5 people have been killed in Israel, including Arab Israelis, and many others have been injured, despite Israel's Iron Dome rocket protection shield taking out hundreds of missiles. But of course, all these rocket attacks have still led to more bloodshed as Israeli fighter jets and missiles have targeted the rocket sites and weapons storages in Gaza, with at least 30 lives lost now in the Palestinian settlement. There have been riots and fires started also in Jerusalem and on the West Bank as tensions, fighting and damage continues to escalate. Now, there's much to consider here as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict goes backwards for the first time in many years. Is the Arab world now testing a weak US president after 3 Arab nations, of course, struck peace deals with Israel under Donald Trump? Certainly that's the view of Donald Trump's former UN ambassador.
Hamas now wants to test Biden because they don't think that he's going to do anything severe. They go and start shooting rockets into Jerusalem. And what does Biden do? He calls for restraint. What he should be doing is having Israel's back.
Yeah, Nikki Haley being very certain there about what's going on. But just as an aside, remember how Trump was banned from Twitter for supposedly inciting those horrible Capitol Hill riots? Well, Hamas leaders and Palestinian supporters are having no trouble using Twitter and other social media as platforms to call for the annihilation of Israel and to quote Hitler on the extermination of Jews. It's just extraordinary how the most vile incitement against Israel and Jewish people is allowed in the public debate on platforms that pretend to care about the standards of civil debate by silencing strident conservatives. Still, important as those double standards are, the reality of the Middle East conflict is far more important. It's challenging and it's a dangerous dilemma. So far, the White House has been little more than an interested spectator calling for calm. But unless order is restored soon, this will emerge as an early test for President Biden's diplomatic skills. Let's cross to Canberra now and catch up with the Liberal MP for Wentworth in Sydney, Dave Sharma, who's a former Australian ambassador to Israel. You were there, Dave, the last time you had these rocket attacks causing a lot of damage and strife. What's your view of the situation confronting us at the moment?
Well, Chris, it looks very familiar to the last major conflict between Israel and Hamas in Gaza in the summer of 2014, which started with a lot of tension between Israeli and Palestinian populations, spilled over into rocket attacks from Hamas, and then really kicked off a cycle of rocket attacks from Hamas, legitimate Israeli responses, and that conflict went on for, I think, well over 50 days and cost the lives of hundreds of civilians on both sides. So, look, I really hope we're not there again. I would just say, though, that I mean, clearly, any government, if their population is under rocket attack, if you've got a terrorist organisation firing rockets at unarmed civilian populations, then any government is going to have to respond to protect their citizens and safety here. So I'd urge Hamas to stop firing these rockets, as much to protect their own population as to protect the Israeli population.
Well, that's exactly the point. We see so many people in this situation will focus more on the Israeli response to this, defending its people and criticise Israel for that. It's very easy to stop that, is stop firing rockets on civilians in Israel. But look, there's always a trigger for events like this, Dave. You would know only too well. Sometimes they just look like a pretext. sometimes, obviously, there can be more to it. But is there a concern here, do you think, given what we've seen over the past few years, that this might be in part motivated at testing the new administration in the White House, testing the strength of their relationship, just how far they're prepared to go to stand by Israel and Prime Minister Netanyahu?
Well, look, I think that's certainly possible, but I think the more plausible hypothesis, if you like, is that Hamas has taken this opportunity to test Israel at a delicate time. They've just been through a fourth election in 2 years. They've still got a caretaker government. Bibi Netanyahu was unable to form a government, yet Yair Lapid has been invited to form a government. Now, that doesn't lessen Israel's capacity to defend itself, but it does mean the political leadership of the country is not clear, and I suspect it's more likely that Hamas is trying to take advantage of, no one being in the hot seat at that time to see what sort of, chaos and they can sow.
All right, well, the other two aspects I'd like to get your comments on, though, is also the role internally, how much this is to do with Hamas making sure that it controls the Palestinian territories or is the predominant force in the Palestinian territories, and also the role of Iran, especially in supplying missiles.
Look, so that's a role it's correct to point out. I mean, historically, the biggest supporters of Hamas have been Iran and Turkey, actually, and Iran particularly on material and weapons precursors. And Israel has done a pretty good job over a number of years in intercepting a lot of those shipments, if you like. But the border between Gaza and Egypt is quite porous. There's a lot of tunnels and a lot of smuggling under there, and that's how Hamas gets their precursors in there. Now, Hamas, positions itself as, if you like, as the sort of along with Iran, as the staunchest opponent in the Islamic world to Israel. And from time to time, they have a need to demonstrate their relevance or their kind of anti-Zionist credentials because they don't do much for their population. I mean, the civilian population in Gaza lives in terrible conditions, even relative to the Palestinian population in the West Bank. So Hamas doesn't have a good record of delivering for its people, and it seeks to cement or re-establish its legitimacy by often provoking conflict with Israel and portraying their anti-Zionist credentials.
Now, Australia would be calling for restraint. The White House has done the same. What are the options here for Joe Biden? Does he need to make a stronger statement? Does he need to do anything or sit back at the moment?
Well, look, I saw Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State, had a conversation with Gabi Ashkenazi, who's the Israeli Foreign Minister, just a few hours ago, I believe. And I think what I saw Tony Blinken say is exactly the right thing, lending support for Israel, to Israel for its right to defend itself, offering, not only diplomatic support, but also material support. Of course, Israel's Iron Dome system was built really with, US military support and assistance. Their missile defence system. Israel's a very capable nation in itself, but the US still provides considerable military assistance to Israel. So, look, I'd expect the Biden administration will have their backs here. I mean, perhaps they've been a bit slow out of the blocks, but I don't think there's any doubt that in a conflict between a terrorist organisation and Israel, well, they'll back Israel any day, as they should.
Thanks for joining us, Dave, and congratulations on being the only politician in Canberra today to give an interview without talking about the budget. Dave Sharma there, the Liberal member for Wentworth and the former Australian ambassador to Israel. Just a worrying situation there. Let's hope it calms down soon. Innocent people being killed on both sides of this conflict already.